He always ordered in German, even though no one here understood a word. The restaurant was expensive, the kind where silence cost as much as the food, and Richard sat alone at a table set for two, the chair across from him empty, as it had been for 30 years. The waiter would nod politely, pretend to comprehend, and bring him whatever was on the menu. It was a ritual, not a meal. A way to hear the language again, even if only from his own mouth. But tonight, when he spoke, the young waitress answered him fluently, in the same dialect, with the same soft lilt of Bavaria he hadn't heard since 1985. And then she placed a folded note beside his glass. He didn't open it right away. He couldn't, because the handwriting looked like hers, and if he was wrong, it would break him. But if he was right, if somehow, after all these years, the past had found him, then maybe some things you abandon never really let you go. Richard Brenner had been coming to this restaurant for 7 years. Every third Thursday of the month, at exactly 7 in the evening, he would walk through the frosted glass doors of Le Jardin, a French bistro tucked between the steel towers of Lower Manhattan. He never varied his routine. Same table by the window, same order, same language that no one else in the room could understand. The staff knew him as the quiet man who tipped well and asked for nothing. They had learned not to engage him in conversation beyond the polite nods and smiles that came with expensive service. He was wealthy. That much was obvious from the tailored suits and the silver watch that caught the light when he lifted his glass. But wealth in New York was common. What made Richard memorable was the loneliness that clung to him like cologne, subtle, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Tonight had started like all the others. He arrived at 6:58, was shown to his table by the host, and settled into the routine that had become his only anchor. The restaurant hummed with the low murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware on porcelain, the occasional burst of laughter from a table in the corner. Outside, the city lights flickered against the November rain, turning the streets into rivers of gold and red. When the waitress approached, Richard didn't look up immediately. He was studying the menu he had memorized years ago, his eyes tracing words he no longer needed to read. It was all part of the ritual, the pretense of choice, the illusion of normalcy. He folded the menu and began to speak, his voice low and careful, shaping the syllables the way he had learned 40 years ago in a small apartment in Munich. Ich hätte gern das Rinderfilet, medium rare, mit Bratkartoffeln. He expected the usual response, a polite pause, a confused smile, the waitress turning to fetch someone who might understand, or simply nodding and bringing him whatever the chef recommended. But instead, she answered without hesitation. Natürlich. Möchten Sie auch einen Rotwein dazu? The words hit him like cold water. His hand, halfway to his glass, froze in midair. He looked up, and for the first time in 7 years, he actually saw the person standing beside his table. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, and eyes that seemed too knowing for her age. Her accent was perfect, not the polished German of a language app, but the real thing, the kind that came from growing up in the hills south of Munich, where the vowels softened and the consonants carried a rhythm that couldn't be taught. You speak German, he said, still in German, because English felt wrong now, like switching channels in the middle of a song. She smiled, a small, careful smile that suggested she knew more than she was saying. My mother taught me. She was from Bavaria. Richard felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate that had been still for decades suddenly grinding back to life. Bavaria, he repeated, and the word felt like coming home and losing home at the same time. The waitress nodded, and then, without explanation, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded once. She placed it beside his water glass, her fingers light and deliberate, and then she stepped back. I'll bring your steak, she said, and walked away before he could respond. Richard stared at the note. The paper was cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been carried for a long time. His hands trembled as he picked it up, and for a moment He considered leaving it unopened. There was safety in not knowing, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, something like hope, made him unfold it. The handwriting was looped and feminine, written in blue ink that had faded slightly with time, and it was in German. Meine Heimat ist auch deine Heimat. My homeland is also your homeland. He read it 3 times, his throat tightening with each pass. The phrase was familiar, painfully so. It was something Greta used to say when they were young, back when the world was smaller and promises felt like contracts. She had said it the night before he left Munich, when they stood on the balcony of her tiny apartment and watched the city lights blur through the rain. She had said it like a spell, like if she spoke it aloud, it would bind him to her across oceans and years. But he had left anyway, and he had never gone back. Richard looked up, searching for the waitress, but she had disappeared into the kitchen. The restaurant continued around him, oblivious to the small earthquake happening at table 12. He folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his mind already racing through impossible possibilities. Who was this woman? How did she know Greta? And why now, after 30 years of silence, was the past reaching out to him through a stranger in a French bistro? The steak arrived 10 minutes later, brought by a different server, a young man with slicked back hair who set the plate down with professional efficiency and left without a word. Richard cut into the meat mechanically, tasting nothing. His eyes kept drifting to the kitchen door, waiting for her to reappear. But she didn't come back to his table. Not that night. When he finally left, 2 hours later, he walked past the host's stand and asked, as casually as he could manage, "The waitress who served me tonight, dark hair, spoke German. What's her name?" The host glanced at his seating chart, then back at Richard with a polite but confused expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have anyone on staff tonight who matches that description." "Are you sure?" "Never mind," Richard said quickly, and pushed through the doors into the rain. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in his apartment, 50 floors above the city, staring at the ceiling and turning the note over in his hands. The paper felt real. The ink was real. The German was flawless, but the host's confusion gnawed at him. Had he imagined it? Was his mind finally doing what his therapist had warned him about for years, constructing fantasies to fill the empty spaces? No. He had the note. Physical evidence. Unless he had written it himself in some fugue state he couldn't remember. The thought was unsettling enough that he got out of bed and poured himself a drink he didn't want. By morning, he had made a decision. He would go back. Not in 3 weeks, when his routine dictated, but tonight. And he would find her, or find out the truth. Whichever came first. Le Jardin looked different on a Friday night. The crowd was younger, louder, more careless with their laughter. Richard felt out of place as he stood by the door, scanning the room for a face he had seen only once but couldn't forget. The host recognized him and offered a table, but Richard shook his head. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A waitress, dark hair, late 20s, speaks German." The host frowned, the same confused expression as the night before. "Sir, I really don't think—" "Please," Richard interrupted, and there must have been something desperate in his voice, because the host softened. "Let me check with the manager." 5 minutes later, Richard was standing in a small office behind the kitchen, facing a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened as he described the waitress, the German conversation, the note. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "Mr. Brenner, I've been managing this restaurant for 12 years. I know every person on my staff, and I can tell you with certainty that we don't have anyone who fits that description. We've never had anyone like that." "But I spoke to her," Richard insisted. "She brought me my food. She gave me this." He pulled out the note, unfolding it on the desk between them. The manager glanced at it, her expression unreadable. "Where did you get this?" "I told you. She gave it to me." "Mr. Brenner," the manager said carefully, "this note wasn't written recently. Look at the ink, the paper. This is old. At least 20, 30 years old." Richard stared at the note, his pulse hammering in his ears. She was right. The paper had the yellowed quality of something that had been tucked away in a drawer for decades. But that didn't make sense. He had watched her pull it from her apron. He had seen her place it beside his glass. "I don't understand," he said quietly. The manager's expression softened. "I think maybe you should go home, Mr. Brenner. Get some rest." He left without arguing. But he didn't go home. Instead, he walked, block after block, through the rain that had started again, soaking through his coat and plastering his hair to his forehead. He walked until he found himself standing outside a building he hadn't seen in 15 years, the old office where he had started his company in the early 90s, back when he was hungry and ambitious and convinced that success was the same thing as happiness. The building had been converted into condos now, the lobby renovated with marble floors and modern lighting. But Richard could still see it the way it used to be, narrow hallways, flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap takeout. He had worked 16-hour days in that building, building something out of nothing, and he had told himself it was worth it. Every sacrifice, every missed call, every promise he didn't keep, it was all for something bigger. But standing there now, drenched and shivering, he couldn't remember what that something was. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in years. He searched for her. Greta Schmidt, Munich, 1958. The search results loaded slowly, and his hands shook so badly he almost dropped the phone. The first link was an obituary. Greta Maria Schmidt, born June 14, 1958, died March 9, 2020. Beloved teacher, devoted daughter, cherished friend. Services held at St. Michael's Church, Munich. Richard read it 3 times, the words blurring together. 2020. She had died 4 years ago. While he was sitting in boardrooms and signing contracts and eating steak alone in expensive restaurants, she had died, and he hadn't known, hadn't even thought to check. The obituary didn't mention a husband, no children, just a list of colleagues and students who would miss her. She had been a German teacher, the obituary said. She had spent her life teaching others the language she loved, the language she had tried to share with him all those years ago. Richard sat down on the curb, heedless of the rain pooling around him. He thought about the waitress, the impossible waitress with Greta's accent and Greta's phrase. He thought about the note, old and worn, as if it had been waiting for him for 30 years. And he thought about what the manager had said, that the note wasn't recent, that it was something from another time. Maybe it was. Maybe Greta had written it decades ago, when she still believed he would come back. And maybe, somehow, it had found its way to him now, when he finally needed to see it. Or maybe he was losing his mind. Both options felt equally plausible. He went back to Le Jardin every night for the next 2 weeks. He sat at the same table, ordered the same meal, and waited for her to appear. She never did. The staff began to avoid him, their polite smiles strained, their service efficient but distant. The manager stopped coming out to talk to him. He had become the sad man at table 12, the one they whispered about in the kitchen. During those 2 weeks, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, remembering. Not the sanitized version of the past he had carefully constructed over decades, but the raw, unfiltered truth of it. He remembered the first time he saw Greta in a bookshop near the university in Munich. It was autumn, 1984, and he was 26 years old, backpacking through Europe on the last of his student loans, trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. She was arranging books on a shelf, humming something he didn't recognize, and when she turned and caught him staring, she didn't smile. She just looked at him with those serious gray eyes and said, in English, "Are you looking for something, or are you lost?" Both, he had wanted to say, but instead he asked her to recommend a book, and she handed him a collection of Rilke poems without hesitation. "Start with this," she said. "If you can read 3 poems without wanting to understand German better, then you're not the person I think you are." He bought the book. And he came back the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, She was teaching him German over coffee in the shop's small cafe. Within a month, he had moved into her apartment, a cramped third-floor walk-up with slanted ceilings and windows that didn't close properly. They were broke and young and stupid with happiness, the kind that doesn't know yet how fragile it is. Richard remembered the way she would correct his pronunciation, her fingers on his jaw, shaping the words. He remembered the way she laughed when he tried to cook German food and failed spectacularly. He remembered the night he told her he loved her, in broken German, and she cried because, she said, he finally sounded like he meant it. But he also remembered the fear, the gnawing, irrational fear that this wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough. He was a college dropout from Pennsylvania with no prospects and no plan, living in a foreign country on borrowed time and borrowed money. Greta didn't care. She worked at the bookshop and taught German to immigrants on the weekends, and she was content with that. But Richard wasn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was wasting his life, that if he didn't go back to America and make something of himself, he would wake up at 40 and realize he had nothing to show for it. So he left. He told Greta it was temporary, just a few months to get his business off the ground, to prove he could do it, and then he would come back for her. She believed him. Or at least, she pretended to. The night before he left, they stood on her balcony, watching the rain, and she said, "Mein Heimat ist auch deine Heimat." My homeland is also your homeland. She said it like a prayer, like if she said it enough times, it would make it true. But Richard never went back. He landed in New York with $300 and a business plan scribbled on notebook paper. He worked construction during the day and taught himself coding at night. He slept on couches, ate ramen, and told himself that every sacrifice was worth it because he was building something. And he was. Within 2 years, he had a software startup. Within 5, he had sold it for enough money to never have to worry again. By then, Greta's letters had stopped coming. He had moved so many times, changed his name to sound more American, reinvented himself so completely that the boy who had lived in a Munich walk-up felt like someone else entirely. He told himself that Greta had moved on, found someone better, built a life that didn't include him. It was easier to believe that than to admit the truth that he had chosen ambition over love because he was too afraid to believe that love could be enough. Now, sitting in the restaurant night after night, Richard let himself feel the weight of that choice. He thought about the wife he had married in his 30s, a perfectly nice woman he had never really loved, who had divorced him after 10 years because she was tired of competing with ghosts she didn't know existed. He thought about his children, 2 daughters who called him twice a year out of obligation and never asked how he was doing. He thought about the houses and cars and watches and all the other things he had accumulated, trying to fill a space that could only be filled by the thing he had walked away from. And he thought about Greta, dying alone in Munich, surrounded by students and colleagues but no family, because she had spent her life giving to others what she had wanted for herself, a home, a connection, a place to belong. But on the 15th night, something changed. He was halfway through his meal when he felt it a shift in the air, a presence behind him. He turned, and there she was. Same dark hair, same knowing eyes. She was holding a tray, but she wasn't dressed like the other servers. She wore a simple black dress, no apron, no name tag. She looked at him the way you look at someone you've been searching for. "You came back," she said in German. "I never left," Richard replied, and it was true. Not really. He had been trapped in this restaurant, in this city, in this life, for 30 years, waiting for something he couldn't name. She set the tray down on the table. On it was a single item, a photograph, faded and creased, of a woman standing in front of a glass building. The woman was young, maybe 30, with light hair and a serious expression. She was wearing a blue coat and holding a piece of paper. "Do you recognize this?" the waitress asked. Richard picked up the photograph, his hands trembling. He recognized the building immediately. It was his old office, the one he had just visited. And the woman in the photo, "Greta," he whispered. "She came here," the waitress said quietly. In 1990. She flew from Munich to New York, and she came to this building to find you. But you had already changed your name, hadn't you? You weren't Richard Brenner anymore. You were Rick Brennan, the American entrepreneur. And when she asked for you, no one knew who she was talking about. Richard felt his chest tighten, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. How do you know this? Because I'm her daughter. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Richard stared at her, his mind racing through the math, the timeline, the implications. But the obituary. It didn't mention. She never married, the waitress said. She never had children. Not biological ones, anyway. But she fostered. Dozens of kids over the years. I was one of them. She took me in when I was 6, taught me German, told me stories about a man she used to love, a man who promised to come back but never did. I didn't know, Richard said, his voice breaking. I didn't know she came looking for me. I thought she moved on. I thought, you thought it was easier to believe that than to face what you'd done, the waitress said, not unkindly. She told me about you, not out of anger, but out of love. She said you were brilliant and kind and so afraid of being ordinary that you couldn't see the extraordinary right in front of you. She said she forgave you a long time ago. But she never stopped hoping you'd come back. Richard's vision blurred, tears mixing with the rain that still clung to his clothes. Why are you telling me this now? Why wait? Because she asked me to, the waitress said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another note. This one newer, the ink still dark. She wrote this before she died. She told me that if I ever met you, if you ever came looking for the past, I should give it to you. She said you'd need it. Richard took the note with shaking hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was weaker than the first note, the letters less sure, but the words were clear. Richard, if you're reading this, it means you finally remembered. I want you to know that I never blamed you for choosing the life you chose. I only wish you had chosen it with your eyes open, instead of running from the one you were afraid to live. Home isn't a place. It's the people we love and the promises we keep. I hope you find yours before it's too late. With all my heart, Greta. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, next to the first note. When he looked up, the waitress was watching him with an expression that was part pity, part challenge. What's your name? He asked. Lily. Lily, he repeated. Thank you for this, for finding me. She nodded. Greta used to say that some debts can only be paid forward. She couldn't have the life she wanted, but she made sure I had one. And maybe you can do the same. Richard didn't understand at first. But then Lily reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, thick with papers. She set it on the table in front of him. What is this? A proposal, Lily said. Greta left behind some money. Not much, but enough. She wanted it to go toward a scholarship fund for kids, learning German kids who couldn't afford the classes, the books, the trips abroad. I've been trying to get it started for 2 years, but I don't have the connections or the resources. You do. Richard stared at the folder, his mind struggling to process what she was asking. You want me to help you build a scholarship fund in her name? Not in her name, Lily corrected. In yours. She didn't want to be remembered. She wanted you to remember. To do something that mattered, not because it would make you successful, but because it would make you whole. Richard opened the folder, scanning the documents inside budget projections, partnership proposals, testimonials from teachers who had worked with Greta. It was thorough, meticulous, the kind of work that took months. And at the bottom of the stack was a photograph of a classroom full of children, their faces bright with the kind of hope that doesn't know yet how heavy the world can be. I don't know if I can do this, Richard said quietly. I've spent so long building things that don't matter. I don't know if I remember how to build something that does. Then learn, Lily said simply. You have time. Greta didn't. Don't waste what she gave you. She stood, smoothing down her dress, and for a moment, Richard saw Greta in her the same determination, the same quiet strength. "I have to go," Lily said, "but I'll be here next Thursday, same time. If you want to talk about the fund, we can. If not," she shrugged, "then at least you'll know you had the chance." She walked away, and this time, Richard didn't try to stop her. He sat at the table for another hour, the folder open in front of him, the rain outside finally slowing to a drizzle. The restaurant emptied around him, the lights dimming, the staff casting sidelong glances as they cleaned up, but no one asked him to leave. Eventually, he stood, tucked the folder under his arm, and walked out into the night. The city was quieter now, the streets slick and reflecting the glow of the streetlights. He thought about Greta, standing in front of his office building 30 years ago, holding a piece of paper and hoping for something that would never come. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing a version of success that left him with nothing but money and silence. And he thought about Lily, who had carried Greta's message for 4 years, waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Richard went home that night and didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his desk and read through the folder, cover to cover, making notes in the margins, drafting emails, sketching out timelines. By the time the sun rose, he had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough to undo 30 years of mistakes, but it was a start. The following Thursday, he returned to Le Jardin. Lily was there, standing by the host's stand, as if she had been expecting him. She smiled when she saw the folder in his hands, now covered in sticky notes and annotations. "You read it," she said. "I did more than read it," Richard replied. "I made some calls. I know people who can help. Foundations, universities, language programs. If we do this right, we can get it launched by the end of the year." Lily's smile widened, and for the first time, Richard saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in anyone's eyes when they looked at him in a very long time. Respect. "She'd be proud of you," Lily said softly. Richard shook his head. "No. She'd be relieved that I finally figured it out." They sat at his usual table and talked for hours, mapping out the logistics, debating the details, arguing over the name. Lily wanted to call it the Greta Schmidt Memorial Fund, but Richard insisted on something else, the Heimat Scholarship, after the word Greta used to use, home. Because that's what the fund was supposed to do, give kids a chance to find a home in a language, a culture, a community. Over the next 6 months, Richard poured himself into the project with the same intensity he had once reserved for building his company. But this time, it felt different. There were no board meetings, no profit margins, no quarterly projections. There was just the work, slow, unglamorous, and deeply satisfying. He met with teachers, visited classrooms, listened to students talk about why they wanted to learn German. Some wanted to connect with their heritage. Some wanted to travel. Some just liked the way the words sounded. And every time Richard heard a student speak, stumbling over the vowels and laughing at their own mistakes, he thought about Greta. He thought about the patience she must have had, the kindness, the belief that language was more than grammar and vocabulary, it was a bridge between worlds. The fund officially launched in December, on what would have been Greta's 66th birthday. They held a small ceremony at a community center in Brooklyn, with speeches from teachers and testimonials from students. Lily stood at the front of the room and told Greta's story, not the sad parts, but the beautiful ones. The way she had opened her home to kids who needed a place to belong. The way she had taught them that language was a gift, not a burden. Richard sat in the back, listening, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt something other than regret. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was quieter than that, more like peace. After the ceremony, Lily found him by the coffee table, holding a paper cup and staring at a photograph on the wall, a picture of Greta's classroom, taken sometime in the early 2000s. She was standing in the middle of a group of students, smiling in a way that suggested she knew something they didn't yet, that the world was hard. But it was also full of moments worth fighting for. "She looks happy," Richard said. "She was," Lily replied. "Even without you." She built a life that mattered. I know, Richard said quietly. I just wish I had been part of it. You are now, Lily said. Maybe not in the way you imagined, but you're here, and that's more than a lot of people can say. Richard nodded, and they stood there in silence, two people connected by a woman neither of them had been able to save, but both of them were trying to honor. It became a routine after that. Every month, Richard would visit one of the schools participating in the scholarship program. He would sit in on classes, talk to students, listen to their stories. He learned that a 17-year-old girl named Sarah wanted to study engineering in Berlin, that a 15-year-old boy named Jake was teaching himself German so he could read Kafka in the original, that a 12-year-old named Mia had never left New York but dreamed of seeing the Alps. And every time he listened, he heard echoes of Greta, her voice, her hope, her belief that language could change a life. One afternoon, almost a year after the fund launched, Richard received a letter. It was handwritten, in German, from a woman named Ingrid Hoffmann. She introduced herself as Greta's oldest friend, someone who had known her since childhood. She had heard about the scholarship fund and wanted to thank Richard for honoring Greta's memory. But it was the last paragraph that stopped him cold. Greta spoke of you often, even near the end. She said she had written you a letter years ago, but never sent it. She kept it in a drawer, tucked inside a book of poetry you had given her. I found it when I was clearing out her apartment. I thought you might want to have it. It's enclosed. Richard's hands shook as he pulled out the second envelope, this one sealed and addressed to him in Greta's handwriting. He sat down at his desk and stared at it for a long time, afraid of what it might say, but eventually he opened it. The letter was dated April 1991, a year after she had come to New York looking for him. Dear Richard, I came to find you, and I couldn't. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe you were always meant to be someone I loved from a distance, like a song I heard once and never forgot. I'm not angry. I'm not even sad anymore. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay. I've built a life here, and it's a good one. I teach children, and they teach me. I've learned that home isn't a person or a place, it's a choice. And I choose to be home in myself. I hope you find that too, wherever you are. With love always, Greta. Richard read the letter 3 times, and then he folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the other notes. He thought about everything he had lost the years. The love, the version of himself that might have been kinder, braver, more present. But he also thought about everything he had found, the students, the teachers, the quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlast him. It wasn't redemption. He knew that. Redemption was too clean, too final. But it was something close. A way of living with the weight of his choices without being crushed by it. That night, Richard returned to Le Jardin for the last time. He sat at his usual table, ordered in German, and waited. Lily didn't appear she had moved on, the manager told him, taken a job teaching German at a high school upstate. But the ritual didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like a farewell. When the meal arrived, Richard ate slowly, savoring each bite. And when he finished, he left an envelope on the table, a donation to the fund, enough to sponsor 5 more students. He didn't leave a note. He didn't need to. The act itself was the message. As he walked out into the December cold, Richard pulled his coat tight and looked up at the sky. Snow was beginning to fall, soft and silent, covering the city in a blanket of white. He thought about Greta, standing on her balcony in Munich all those years ago, watching the rain and believing in promises. He thought about Lily, carrying her foster mother's legacy with grace and determination. And he thought about himself, the man he had been, the man he was now, and the man he still hoped to become. Home, Greta had written, is a choice. And for the first time in 30 years, Richard chose it. He walked home through the snow, past the glass towers and the crowded streets, past the life he had built and the ghosts he had carried. And when he finally reached his apartment, he sat down at his desk and began to write. Not a business plan or a strategy document, but a letter. To Greta, to Lily, to himself. He wrote about regret and forgiveness, about the things we lose and the things we find. He wrote about language as a bridge, about memory as a gift, about the quiet heroism of people who build lives that matter even when no one is watching. And he wrote about hope, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that makes the future worth walking toward. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He didn't know who he would give it to, or if he ever would. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he had written it, that he had finally said the things he should have said 30 years ago. The next morning, Richard woke early and walked to Central Park. The snow had stopped, leaving the city clean and quiet, the way it only ever was in the hours before dawn. He found a bench near the reservoir and sat down, watching the sun rise over the water. He thought about Greta's letter, the one she had written but never sent, kept in a drawer like a secret she couldn't quite let go of. He thought about how much courage it must have taken to write those words, to say she was okay even when she wasn't, to choose peace over bitterness. And he realized that he had been given a gift, not the chance to undo the past that was impossible, and maybe it always had been, but the chance to live differently in the present. To stop running from the person he used to be and start building toward the person he still could become. It wouldn't erase his mistakes. It wouldn't bring Greta back or repair the relationships he had broken. But it would mean something. To the students who would receive scholarships. To the teachers who would watch their students thrive. To Lily, who would see her foster mother's dream realized. And maybe, just maybe, it would mean something to him too. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in silence. And inside, Richard sat at his desk, staring at the envelope, and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was a peaceful one. And for now, that was enough.